Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today I have a very special guest on for the first time, Dr. Hayden Pritchard, right? Hopefully I said that. I was going to say it the American way, but I asked him beforehand. Hopefully I got that right. It's funny, man. Anytime I say someone's name and they're like, oh yeah, this is how you say it, I always like get in my head about it and end up messing it up. But anyways, if you're not familiar with Hayden, he holds a PhD from Auckland University of Technology. His thesis was titled Tapering Strategies to Enhance Maximal Strength. He is a competitive powerlifter, and he recently became a father, and he has a passion for helping other dads become stronger versions of themselves. And he also hosts the Stronger Dads Collective podcast. Hayden, appreciate your time, man. Thanks for coming on.
No worries at all, mate. It's a pleasure to be here. And with the pronunciation, as a fellow podcast host, I fully understand it. When you practice it in your head and you're like ready to go, and then it comes out and you're like, oh no, I said that wrong again.
And it's so weird because you literally just press a button. It's not any different, but you press a button to record and things just go out the window. I also forgot to mention Hayden also writes for Reps, which is Lane Norton's research review as well too. He also has that under his belt. But yeah, man, thanks for coming on. Looking forward to chatting with you today. I guess if you don't mind, maybe just starting with just brief background in terms of how you got to where you're at today.
Yeah, man, it's always those questions, isn't it? How far back can you go? But I always like to go back to my years at high school because that was when I got exposed to strength training for the first time and became really interested in the whole training process and how the body adapts to training. I don't know, I was always a little bit of a science geek, and it intrigued me as to how things work. As I started getting into track in particular, like I played rugby. Being a New Zealander, all of us tend to play rugby, all of us young guys. But I started doing track, and I remember heading into the library and reading books about training, and then having a coach who would take me and took us through different phases of training and these sorts of things in the gym. And it was the first time I'd ever had any sort of guidance in the gym. And I was quite lucky to get that from someone who had experience. And yes, it was a sport-oriented way, but we did squats, we did bench press, we did rows, we did all of these big compound movements. And so from quite early on, 15, 16 years old when I was training for that, which is now 20 years of resistance training, I was always interested in why we do this and what the adaptations are and how does that happen. And so I feel that's what led me down the path of studying sports science and being interested in this, because I wanted to understand physiology better. I wanted to understand why adding a stress causes an adaptation and what actually changes and those sorts of things. And so I did sprinting for a while, and that was where I first got into lifting. And then as you get into sort of university ages in New Zealand, at least, the athletics kind of starts to drop off a cliff. Like you have New Zealand secondary schools, really big, massive meet. And then when you go to the New Zealand championships, once you get into the senior grades, there's not as many people around. And so my whole enthusiasm for that, not for the sport itself, dropped, but there just wasn't the same competition around locally, and you're competing against high schoolers. It's not the same sort of vibe as when you were one of those high schoolers. And so I just started doing more lifting, and I had a lecturer at the time who said, hey, you're pretty strong, you should try this powerlifting thing. And I'd never heard of powerlifting prior to that. I just knew that I liked getting stronger and that trying to bench 100 was fun and all those sorts of things. And so when he mentioned this, I had to look into it and found out a bit more about the sport. I was back in the day when there were forums and all of these sorts of things. And this was as I was probably third year of university, I would say. So my last year of uni, and then into my honors year. And so I got into powerlifting, and I just loved it and had a bit of strength. And it was something I could excel at again. And I could use this competitive drive that I had when I was sprinting, although I was never great at that. I was able to work hard and improve. And that's the part that always fascinated me. And then you've got this sport where it's literally the number on the bar, right? How much more objective can you get than that? It's just, it is what it is. And if you get it, and that's the number. So I love that, because being a scientist and loving a bit of quantitative data, it was nice to be able to have a sport where you could quite easily measure things like volume, like the weight you were hitting, your progression over time. All of these sorts of things are very easy to track. And so I did powerlifting for about 4 or 5 years, competed for New Zealand at a couple of IPF World Championships. So the 20 Raw Worlds in Russia, and then the 2014 Worlds in South Africa. So those are really cool and awesome time to meet all these different people from different countries. And a lot of those people that I met at those events, I'm still friends with today or follow on Instagram and have had on my podcast and things. So that was the powerlifting side. And then as I was finishing up at my first stint of university. And so research-wise, I was interested in this, and I started reading more about it, and doing a sports science degree was quite nice, and I could have a look. And at the time, there wasn't the same sort of volume of literature that there is now around strength training. That's exploded, I would say, in the last 5 or 10 years. Like early on in my degree, so you're thinking probably 15 years ago or 14 years ago when I was first started studying, There was a bit more research coming out at that time, but it was quite early days in terms of the strength literature. Like it's quite early. Like we don't actually have a whole lot of evidence yet. It's still early days and we're still building these pictures and things. And we know a whole lot more now than we did then. But back then, the majority of the research was still on endurance sports. And so there wasn't a whole lot that we knew. And after a bit of working, I ended up becoming a lecturer at UCOL here in Palmerston North. And as I was doing that, I was thinking, man, I'd love to do my PhD. And so I'd been into powerlifting for 4 or 5 years, probably 4 years at that stage. And I knew there was a guy up in AUT who had a good background on strength training. He was one of the guys in New Zealand that would have been like an expert at the time in that field. And so I spoke to him about PhD topics, and he brought up this idea of tapering, which you've mentioned. That was what my PhD was on. And all that we really knew about tapering at that time was from the endurance literature. And a lot of the stuff I read was trying to understand tapering from that perspective and then apply that into the strength world. Long story short, that's what I did my PhD on. And I think the first year I started my PhD was the last year that I competed internationally at powerlifting. And so then I focused more on the other piece. And here we are. I've dabbled in CrossFit and weightlifting and all sorts of things since that time. And so it's been quite a cool experience to try other strength dominant sports and see the similarities, the differences, and how different people view things and challenge some of your assumptions about things like concurrent training and all those sorts of aspects that sometimes people make a big deal out of. And then once you've read some more literature as well as done a little bit of it yourself, you realize, it's probably not as big a thing as we might make out, cardio killing your gains and all those sorts of things. But yes, I guess a nutshell summary of how I am where I am now. I'm currently working. I just left my full-time job about a month and a bit ago to try and dive all in on coaching and some consulting work and stuff as well. So that's where I'm at life at the moment. And it's a bit of a scary risk, but it's been fun so far. And as I mentioned to you, I'm keeping pretty busy.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. So was your full-time job outside of fitness or was it fitness related?
Completely outside. So I had been working in academia for about 8 years, I think it was when I left. And then I left that and went into the health sector in New Zealand. So we have a big public health system here, and there's a whole bunch of different components of that. And essentially I jumped into health because it's adjunct to fitness and that. But the work I was doing was nothing to do with what I'd learned or anything like that. It was more just applying some of those critical thinking and analytical skills, ability to communicate, those things that are valuable anywhere into another field, and kind of dove deep into that for the last 4 or 5 years. And then thought, man, I miss this stuff and I just want to give it a good nudge while there's this opportunity. So yeah.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. But it sounds like you probably stayed within it, right? Because you also have your podcast as well too. So I'm assuming or did you just recently get that up and rolling again?
Now the podcast has been going for about 2 years at the end of this year. Yep. So I started doing that again. So when I was sorry, we're getting into the nitty gritty here. When I first went to the health sector, I was still coaching on the side, and I did that with RTS for about 1.5 years, I think it was, during that time frame. But then it just became a bit too much. And when I transitioned roles there, I stopped coaching for about 1 year and then got into it again about probably 6 to 9 months ago. I think it must have been maybe longer than that. It might have been like 1 year to 18 months. When everything blurs together, when you've got a couple of young kids and every day just feels like it's slow, and then it goes, what is it? The days are slow, but the years are long. The years are fast or something like that. I don't know what the saying is. Something along those lines.
They freaking fly by. That's what I've noticed so far in a short time. Cool. Yeah. Obviously pretty competitive from a powerlifting standpoint. Is that something that you said you still kind of work on there with that? I know you said you dabble a little bit in CrossFit, weightlifting and stuff like that, but it sounds like always come back to the powerlifting there.
Yeah. I don't know. It's just hard not to want to be stronger again. The real challenge that I have at the moment, and my big thing at the moment, so I've gone back to fully focusing on strength the last 9 months. So last year I was doing like longer distance running, so half marathons, and trying to just keep a level of strength, like pursue a hybrid type approach. I was probably more invested in the running side, but didn't want to get weak. I wanted to keep a baseline so I could come back. And then I thought to myself, I think it was about early this year, that, man, if you ever want to hit that lifetime goal of a 300 kilo deadlift, which I think is 660 pounds or so for Americans, you're probably better to do that now. There's plenty of 50-something-year-olds running marathons, but there's a lot less 50-something-year-olds deadlifting 300 kilos. So in my head, I took that as for the next couple of years, depending on how long it takes, if I want to hit that 300 kilo deadlift, I probably need to commit to that. Keep doing the conditioning for the heart health side, because obviously nowadays, to me, that's a much bigger priority, because having kids, you want to give yourself the best chance to be here, right? When you're early 20s or whatever, and you're not thinking about that long-term thing as much, like you may let it fall off the wagon. But for me, I'm like, I need to make sure I keep a semblance of cardiovascular health in there as well. But yeah, the big focus now for my training is really, I'm doing powerlifting again. Basically, I registered again with the federation here, and I'll probably do a couple of competitions in 2025. And hopefully within the next 12 to 18 months would be my hope, that 300 kilo deadlift, which is the main objective while I'm doing it, can get ticked off, because it's been a lifetime goal of mine. And what was the best? I think I hit a 290 in competition. So 22 pounds off hitting what I wanted. And that was actually why I started CrossFit. So that was another story. My training partner bet with me that at the end of 2014, if I hadn't hit a 300 kilo deadlift, I had to enter a CrossFit competition. And we'd been doing some seminars at CrossFit Gym. So we'd seen a lot of the cool stuff of them trying to learn from experts and all that sort of stuff. And we had quite a different perspective probably to other powerlifters at the time of CrossFit. We had favorable opinions of it because of the fact that they had shown us, hey, we're really invested to learn and all of these sorts of things. And it wasn't what we saw on the internet with these guys are arrogant and blah, blah, blah. Those perceptions other people probably make of it, or based on a couple of bad eggs. And yeah, I ended up not hitting that at the last competition of 2014. I missed my second pull at 287, and I had to go for that again to get the win at the competition, where the plan was like, I think it was 270, 287, and then 300 on the third. But I never got the chance to attempt the 300 on the third because I missed it on the second, had to come back and get it on the last one. So then I missed it, and there I was doing CrossFit competition about 6 weeks later, which was, I remember the first event that we had for that was running up like this little mount/hill type thing where this road comes up to a viewing point, and we had to run up this road. And that was like day one event. And I just thought, me and hills and being another probably 10 kilos on what I am now, or at least 6 kilos on what I am now, it was not much fun. So it was a very rough introduction for me.
And probably no training to get ready for that either. You just thrown into the
fire.
Very
there. Minimal. Yeah. So that was part of the fun of it, right? Was chuck a bet on and have a gamble and see what happens. And it didn't go my way, but I don't regret that. It was good fun getting involved in that. And I met a lot of cool people and also found weightlifting, which was pretty cool.
Well, like you said, doing other modalities of training probably is never a bad idea, at least for a period of time. Especially, like you said, you've done powerlifting most of your life. So it's getting outside of that, doing some cardio, stuff like that's probably been super helpful. And like you said, I'm sure you've had some insights, like you may have mentioned, and I'd love to hear about those in terms of doing other modalities that maybe you had that you're able to bring to powerlifting or whatever that looked like for you.
Yeah. I think a lot of it is really, I would say weightlifting challenged the assumptions of being able to do much higher frequency training than I thought was possible, because almost every day that you weightlift, if you think of all of the weightlifting movements, so you've got snatch, clean and jerk, right? The other competition movements, snatch and clean and jerk. All of those are leg dominant activities. So even if you're doing a jerk, which is not, it's throwing a bar over your head, it's not pressing a bar over your head. So the training movements are still basically a quarter squat is a jerk motion, right? It's a kind of a variation of a quarter squat. A clean, you receive it in a full position. Same with a snatch. So you're always doing full squats. You're always doing pulling movements from the floor. That was probably one of the big assumptions for me that got challenged, was how often we can squat. And back in the day, there was John Bros doing the squat every day stuff, and those sorts of things were massive. And he came from a weightlifting background. So when I see it in that I'm like, it makes sense. But it was like, the way that people can do these things, it just challenged a little bit of the things that I would think about. How often should we be squatting for powerlifting, or how often should we be bench press? Like whatever it is, those sorts of things. There are ways that you can prescribe training that allow you to train at a higher frequency and not end up completely ruined. And part of that is John Bros' athletes don't go into maxing out back squat every single day in their first week of training. And I think that's one of the biggest things, is how do we manage training load over a period of time to progressively overload someone. And progressive overload is sometimes a little bit misunderstood, right? We think it's about putting weight on the bar every time, but in reality, it's about doing what you're capable of so that you are still overloading the system. And what happens is you get stronger, and so therefore you can handle more weight at the same effort. And that's how it works. And then the same thing with the recovery. You recover faster. So therefore to overload, you have to give yourself a little bit more. But it's like don't force it. Let it happen. Let the signs of your body tell you that you're ready for it, and use it that way. But those sorts of assumptions were some of the big ones, I think, for me that got challenged, is how you can arrange a training program, the way you can do things a lot more higher frequently than you probably think, if you dose it in the right way. Because there's a big difference between a maximal effort deadlift and a maximal effort snatch. Like the pulling from the floor is still part of it, but there's a heck of a lot of difference in what those two things mean.
Yeah. So for you then, was it like, hey, I can use, and again, I'm sure this is very context dependent, but for you, was it like, hey, I could utilize higher frequencies in my powerlifting, or was it the opposite for you in terms of kind of your thought? Like, again, and I'm sure, like you said, it really depends on like the intensity that you're training at there that's going to manipulate that. So was that what it was? It allowed you to rethink in terms of like, hey, if I dose my intensity, I can increase the frequency a bit in terms of deadlift.
If I'm prescribing things in an appropriate manner, there's a way that I can potentially add more than I thought I could in terms of exposure to that stimulus. I might be able to squat more days per week, but those squat days might look a little bit different. And I've always been one of the people, and so I do have a little bit of a bias with this. I find that when I'm frequently exposed to a stimulus, it feels smoother and it feels better. But that means I'm probably not going to go in and do 4 or 5 sets of 10 on a back squat at a high intensity. It might be a couple of sets or 3 sets or whatever, and I could do that more frequently. That's not necessarily the way that I train at the moment, but it's more just challenging some of those assumptions that if this was to fit for someone in a certain scenario, because that's the other thing. We often get constrained with our weeks and how we can fit things in. A 4-day training week often fits quite nicely because it can fit around work and you can not be all of those aspects that kind of come into it. If you were a full-time athlete, and that's the other big thing that we see with something like weightlifting, is there are professionals in that sport, and the people at the top level that are training 13, 14 times a week, doing double day sessions and stuff like that. Those people have it as a full-time job. And that's very different to you or I, who we may have to do other things to earn a living. So there are there's a lot of nuance to that. But I guess the thing I learned, or I guess I discovered from that, was sometimes we put limitations on ourselves and sometimes we can challenge the way that we might train, because there are ways that you can do things that might be a little bit different. But you probably need to change your approach if you're going to do that.
Because with strength, I haven't had too many people on here to talk specifically about strength. But again, strength, we're talking like for powerlifting, you're trying to lift as much as you can. I think, and you hit on this here, you don't necessarily want to go in and try to hit like your 1 rep max all the time. And the big thing is like the skill component to it. I feel like people underestimate the skill component of strength and how important that is. And if you're always going in fatigued and you're always pushing, you're going to miss out on that. And you also hit on the fact that you're like, for you, when I do it maybe a little bit more frequently, I feel better. I get that stimulus. And again, to me, that sounds like kind of the skill side of strength there that you're sharpening with that.
Yeah. And I guess that's the biggest difference, right, between hypertrophy and strength, is what is the outcome that we're after. If you're training for hypertrophy, the outcome that you want is a bigger muscle. Whereas if you're training for strength, the outcome that you want is more weight on the bar. And while those things will often go hand in hand, they definitely have to go together. And we see that with weight classes and powerlifting. There's people that will stay in a relatively low weight class for their entire career, but yet they progress year on year, and they might already be maxed out. If they're 74s, they might be maxed out at the top of that weight class, cutting from 76 to 74 every meet. You can't get up to 78 and cut 4 kilos and not whatever that difference is and expect it not to have an impact. So your ability to add more muscle mass is limited to an extent. They still progress. And so therefore there are those other neurological adaptations, the skill adaptations, the efficiency of your movement, all of those little bits and pieces that may not be as important for someone trying to build hypertrophy, because you don't need to be strong. If your quads are bigger, your quads are bigger. It doesn't matter if you squat more or not. What we're looking at is, did your quads grow? Do they look better on stage if you're a bodybuilder? Like those sorts of aspects that to a powerlifter don't necessarily matter, right? And then I guess, as you say, that comes into the training piece. And that is, if I am training for hypertrophy, my training might look quite different to someone who is training for powerlifting. And one of the simplest, I think, examples of that would be the exercise selection. Right? If I'm a powerlifter, I'm probably going to have to do almost every week, or maybe multiple times per week, as we've just talked about, some form of squat, right? Whether that's the actual competition squat movement or a close variation of it, you have to do that. If you're a bodybuilder, there is no requirement to do a squat, right? Yes, it's a great exercise and there's heaps of benefits to it in terms of the hypertrophy and the different number of muscles that it hits and all of those other things. But that doesn't mean you have to use that. You could use exclusively machines and have a fantastic physique, but you would probably be a terrible powerlifter. But if that's not your goal, why does that matter? You can still have a fantastic physique and not have to do a squat, a bench press, or a deadlift. Like, it's just, I think part of this thing, we like to think that those exercises are the kings. And yes, like, I'm fully biased towards it. I love a squat. I love a bench press. I love a deadlift. If you're a lifestyle client of mine who may not be a powerlifter, you're probably still going to be getting some variation of those movements regularly, because I love them. And if you've come to me, you know that I love them. So you probably should be expecting to see something like that. I'm not going to just be throwing purely machines at you. So yeah, 100%. And I think that whole specificity of what we're trying to achieve at the end of the day is what is the key there. If we are wanting to be stronger at a specific movement, you have to do that specific movement. If you're wanting to build the size of a muscle, you need to do some exercises that train that muscle. So it's training muscles versus training movement. And there's a lot of crossover, but it's not one for one.
Yeah, no, I feel like a lot of people, they think that it is the same. Like, I feel like there's a lot of overlap, but there is a lot of difference. Like you said, if you do want to get stronger, you do obviously need to do those specific movements. I guess one thing too, and to come back to this, I think the other big thing that people maybe get wrong here with the training too is the importance of being we want to limit fatigue, right? When it comes to strength, whereas like hypertrophy, it's the opposite. And I feel like you probably had to do a lot of diving into that with tapering and everything like that as well too.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's probably the whole fatigue fatigue is an interesting one, and probably managing fatigue and training for strength is an interesting thing. Because I think historically there's probably quite a big emphasis on overload, and then I need to have a little bit of a an overreach, and then I need to pull back, and then I need. Whereas I think these days, a lot of the coaching, at least of powerlifting, it's more about managing it so that you don't burn out the lifter and you don't go into these states of extreme fatigue, and actually you're able to progress week to week. If you look at the reactive training systems model with emerging strategies, which is essentially I expose you to the same microcycle of training or week of training, week, half week, whatever it might be, depending on how they've set it up repeatedly. And then I look at your adaptations over time, right? And so that was a really interesting thing to see, because oftentimes with the way that those are structured, you're not wanting to give someone so much that they get completely burnt out and then can't do the next week. Because the idea is I'm giving you the same thing, giving you the same thing, giving you the same thing. So if you think of a general adaptation syndrome, right? That's the stimulus that you're giving them. And if you gave that too much, you'd dig this big hole, right? So you need to give them enough to recover from. And I feel like that whole giving someone enough but not too much, and that's, again, it's always a fine line between getting that right, is part of the way that people tend to train now when we're training for strength. We're not wanting to just hammer someone with a whole bunch of volume, fatigue them, and then hope that they rebound from that. We're wanting to give them enough so that we can actually measure weekly and see, cool, your estimated 1RMs are going up. And that's part of the cool thing about that emerging strategies approach, right? Is we're always monitoring what's happening with someone's 1 repetition maximum. And Mike Teixeira might be an awesome one to have on this podcast to discuss that in more detail, because he's got a lot of cool thoughts. And he thinks really interestingly about the whole training process, and he's awesome to chat to. So I would highly recommend getting him on at some stage if you haven't already. But that whole idea, we're actually wanting to be able to see improvements over the course of a training block. If you were hammering someone's with fatigue over that and you were overloading them all the time, you're not going to see that week to week. Like, their squat isn't going to jump up week to week if you're just burning them to the ground. So 100%, I think there is an element of that we need to be managing fatigue a bit more for the strength athlete. But I would almost say that's probably still the case with bodybuilding, right? We probably still want to recover enough to be able to have another really good workout again, because I think that's probably the key there, right? With the whole recovery piece, is giving someone enough fatigue so that the next time they do a similar training stimulus, whether that be 2 days, a week, whatever someone's philosophy is, they're able to come in and have another good session. But probably for the powerlifter, it is more important, because psychologically, if that weight on the bar was going down week to week, that's not going to be very encouraging, right? Like, that whole perception of that. And if your coach keeps telling you trust the process, it's going to rebound. It is still really hard to continue to come in week after week and be as motivated and as driven as if you are seeing these little bits like, oh, my E1RM went up this week because my RPE was lower. Awesome. That's like motivating and inspiring. And so there is that aspect of training that to me has probably become almost more important as I've got older and through this training journey, is actually understanding the psychology of what you're doing in the gym and what causes you to buy in more, what causes you to come back and be more enthusiastic. Because we know if someone is really invested in their training program, they believe in what their coach is telling them to do, they're going to put in more, they're going to do the other things right. Like, they're going to be more on top of their nutrition, they're going to be more on top of their sleep, they're going to be more on top of these things that all come in to combine to actually produce the end product or the result. So yeah, it's an interesting little topic.
With hypertrophy, building muscles, people want to argue about the optimal number of sets, rep range, exercise, but it's, again, you got to find what works for the person too. And are they seeing that progression, like you said, because that's going to make them more likely to stick to it. You know what I mean? 100%. So yeah, I totally agree with that. I think, again, like, figuring out how to make that specific person tick and make sure that they stay consistent is just so important and overlooked when we talk these kind of super sciencey type stuff, right? People will just go in the rabbit holes with that, but it's like, is that what they want to do? Do they enjoy that? That is part of it, which, as you mentioned here, it's like with the fatigue thing, it's like, hey, to progress, you do need to push it a little bit, right? So I think there is a little bit of getting uncomfortable, but at the same time, like
100%, if you're training, like, you have to train hard to get somewhere, right? I'm not arguing that at all. Like, all I mean is you don't need to dig yourself and give you 8 sets or something like that if you've been used to training with 3, just because I read somewhere in the literature that 8 sets is better than 3. That's not how the whole training process works. And I guess that's where this whole optimal argument can be really, I don't know, taken out of context, maybe. Like, that might be the term. Because we look at something and we say, oh, the literature says that 15 to 20 sets is better than 5 to 10. Okay, cool. That means I have to give someone 15 to 20 sets. No, because the 15 to 20 sets was better for this person in this context. If I've got a new person coming into the gym, or someone who's only been training for 3 to 6 months, do they really want to be doing 8 sets of squats on one day? Like, probably not. They're probably better to have exposure to a variety of different exercises for interest's sake more than anything. But also the fact that they just can't handle that volume, right? We have to progressively add training volume to someone over time. And again, it comes back to that progressive overload. What is someone prepared to be able to handle? And so if you're used to training with 3 sets or 4 sets or whatever it might be, any arbitrary number, right? We have to be careful that over time we don't just hammer someone because we read somewhere that the 50 plus sets per week, or whatever it was, study that came out maybe 6 months ago or whenever it was, like, That doesn't mean you have to do 50 sets. And also, what was the percentage difference of that being better than the other thing? There's all of these other factors that you need to look at. 4 sets may be better than 3. It might be by 1%, 2%, 3%, which for John, up the road, who's only just started training 3 months ago, is the extra DOMs that he's going to get from that worth it when that's going to then make him not come back next week? And as someone gets more well-trained, then again, it's more looking at what are they doing? How can I intelligently increase that if that is the path I want to take? Because yes, oftentimes more volume means someone will get better results. Oftentimes, not always, right? There are times when if you actually take something away, the person will get better results because they've actually been overdoing it, like we talked about before. They might be too fatigued, and actually you remove some of that, you increase the body's capability to adapt, and they get better results from doing less. It can happen, and it does happen. And optimal, I find it such a strange term, and especially now, and probably yourself as well with having a kid, right? Like, man, optimal has changed for me.
Yep.
A lot. Like for me now, good enough is good enough, and fitting in what I can when I can, and sometimes doing less because I've had a shitty night of sleep or whatever it might be. Like, man, there's so much more to manage. And I guess when you are able to invest all into it, cool, let's jump into this. Let's dive in. Let's go optimal. Let's track everything perfectly and add these increases as we go. But then as life circumstances change, we also have to be willing to be flexible and adapt and say, actually, okay, cool, X number of sets was great when you had all this capacity to devote to training. You had all your recovery stuff bang on. Now you've got a newborn in the house. You're sleeping less. Your nutrition's not quite as sharp as it could be. All of those aspects. Okay, we need to change what we're doing in the training so that your body can actually still handle and adapt. And minimum effective dose, man, I love that stuff at the moment. Especially last year, that was what my training was. It was do some minimum effective dose training, little as I can get away with, but still make some progress incrementally over time, because it kept me turning up when I may not otherwise turn up. But it also kept me progressing and feeling like I'm not going backwards, which was the win at that time for me when we had newborn in the house.
And my understanding too of strength versus hypertrophy too is the kind of minimum effective dose from like a strength perspective, if you're just trying to maintain that, is a little bit less than hypertrophy. I don't think it's very much for hypertrophy, but I think from a strength perspective, at least my understanding is it's less potentially to maintain.
100%. Like I think you can get away with almost one hard set on an exercise in a week, or for a squat, it might be 2 times a week. I can't remember the exact details of it, but literally building up to a heavy, hard single. And that's pretty much it. A little bit better was building up to a single and then having a couple of drop-off sets. I think it was benching 3 times, squatting twice, and deadlifting once or something like that with that type of a protocol. So it's not a lot, right? Even if that was bench, that's a maximum of 9 sets across an entire week and a minimum of 3. It's very little training volume. So you could come in and do 2 or 3 sessions, probably less than 30 minutes and be done. And it's fully possible to do that and maintain. And how long that lasts for, it's hard to say. There's plenty of studies that have even shown that if you're reducing your training to something like 20%, can't remember if that's the exact figure, significantly reducing your total training volume versus what you're doing before, you can hold on to your strength for a long time. And I guess that's the difference though between already being somewhere and building to somewhere, right? Like we're talking here about maintenance levels or very small gains, not optimal progress.
I'm sure you're familiar with, especially being data-driven strength, like some of the stuff they do with when they've had their meta regressions come out recently too, in terms of like strength and everything. And as you were saying that earlier, you talked about, hey, you got to be flexible and everything like that. And hey, what's the optimal? And I know, for example, from a hypertrophy perspective, they said, hey, once you get that like 3 to 10 sets per week, it's like you've largely maxed out most of your gains. From there, it's like you could do more, but again, like you said, if you have these time constraints, this isn't even something that we need to necessarily like worry about at that point. You just need to get it. So interesting there with that. Which, speaking of, has that changed anything in terms of, I know they had their recent meta on strength and hypertrophy type stuff. Did that change anything for you in terms of the volume side of things there or anything? I think it was what they looked at volume and frequency from a strength perspective. We've dove into the hypertrophy side, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on the strength side of what they found there.
To be honest, I haven't read that one recently, so I'd be lying if I was saying that I've got it in front of me and I can bounce off it, but probably nothing substantial has changed in my perspectives of strength training. And I think for me, the main reason is because everything, or the way that I look at everything, tends to be very individual to the person that I have in front of me. And so with a study, you'll get a really good basis, and with literature, you get a really good basis of what could work and what are pretty good targets for most people most of the time. And so, gives you a good ballpark and a good place to start. And then the changes that you can make based upon that come, right? If you give someone that and it's too much and they're not progressing, they're going backwards, then, hey, I might need to change something and I might need to give them less. And so it's always that evaluation piece for me when I'm training an individual, is looking at who is in front of me and how can I give them what they need, rather than if I was making a generic program that I could chuck online and get the best results, I think I would definitely dive more into, okay, what exactly should this look like? How would that impact what I do? Will I do 3 or 4 sets of this? Will I do 2 or 5 sets of this? Those sorts of questions might be a bit more meaningful there. But for me, generally, it's start with something that I know the person's going to be able to do and then build on it over time. So I know that's a little bit of a potentially cop-out answer, but I think it's also probably true to how I approach coaching, right? Is I need to know what the person in front of me has been doing, how they've been adapting, and then make judgment calls from that. Like, I think typically anywhere from 3 to 5 sets for an exercise is a pretty good place to start. And I will typically start on the lower end of that. And sometimes I'll use introductory weeks with people as well, where we might even start with as little as 2 work sets on things and gradually build up from there to see what works, to see where that line is of, this is too much, the person's feeling sore, they're beat up, I need to probably scale back a little bit, versus they're always fresh, they're telling me that there's more time, they want to add more. So yeah, I don't think I answered.
Yeah, no, I love your approach, right? It's, again, we just want to use kind of the research to, give us an idea. But like you said, really at the end of the day, it's that specific person that we need to focus on. And so again, I like what you said there. Hey, probably 3 to 5 sets if we're focused on strength. And then again, from there, just base it off of how they're progressing. And I think that's the best way to do it. I think
one of the other things, can I just add something little there?
For sure, man. Yeah.
One of the other things that I did want to probably say about that is one of the things that they found that was quite interesting in some of their literature is the whole proximity to failure piece and the importance of that for strength versus hypertrophy. And that when we're doing hypertrophy stuff, like getting closer to those higher RPEs, the near max efforts becomes a whole lot more important. But with the strength stuff, anywhere from a 6, 7 RPE can actually be really effective. And that's probably, I think, the biggest difference. And we touched on this earlier. And so when I am prescribing stuff for someone who is looking to get stronger, it may not always be pushing as hard as what we might think is necessary, because we're trying to develop efficiency, we're trying to develop force production, we're trying to develop these things that being at a slightly lower RPE can be important. Yes, we're going to expose them to higher intensities as we go. But I just wanted to mention that is that actually when we're training hypertrophy, the proximity to failure probably becomes a bit more important. When we're training for strength, it's still an element. And there's times when we're going to want to push closer because there's a skill to maxing out, there's a confidence to maxing out, those types of things. But actually a lot of the training can be 6, 7, 8 RPE. And we don't even need to push 8 and 9s or 10s very often at all. I mean, I remember once at a seminar that we did, Jono and I took the seminar somewhere pretty local, and someone asked us, it was the strangest question for us because it wasn't something we'd ever thought about. They're like, how often do you plan to fail a lift? We were like, plan to fail? What do you mean? But I guess it comes from that thing, right? Like when we're doing training for hypertrophy, we might actually push all the way to failure relatively regularly, potentially, depending on the exercise. But when we're training for strength, it was like almost a foreign concept to me. I'm like, I never plan to fail a lift in the gym. Like the only time I would fail was if it was a testing day or a meet, right? I'm typically not thinking today's the day I'm going to go in and fail. And so it was just an interesting concept to think about. And I think it kind of points that out, right? Like that typically for a strength athlete, we're going to veer a few reps shy of failure most of the time. Every now and again, we might push closer to failure to get an experience with grinding and that sort of thing. But you don't want to do that too much because the sort of reward that you get from that isn't a lot more, but the fatigue that it adds is. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up because, that is super important, right? One of the main differences, like you said, we typically, from a hypertrophy standpoint, for trying to build muscle, we probably want to be fairly close to failure most of the time. But from a strength perspective, you can leave a little bit more in the tank. And again, it's funny because as you said, like for me, that's still what I was like taught growing up, right? It's, you gotta grind every single one. And again, that's sure enough, I was spinning my wheels in terms of adding strength and it makes sense. So,
I think we get caught up, I think, we think intensity, and sometimes I think we think intensity of the effort. Oh, how hard. I was having to, that was a really intense effort. Whereas oftentimes when you're reading the scientific literature, intensity is talking about percentage of 1RM, right? Like it's the weight on the bar. So high intensity, when we're thinking of it from a numerical perspective, might be greater than 80 or 85% of 1RM. But if you're doing a double or a triple at 85%, piece of cake, right? You're doing a double at 90%, it's pretty easy. But the intensity is still high. And so maybe that's a little bit of where some of the like ways that we talk about things and the words that we use as well sometimes may get taken out of context. Like you hear, I need to train with high intensity for strength. I'm going into the gym and I'm grinding. And so maybe there's a little bit of that historic. I'm not too sure. I'm just spitballing there.
No, I think you're right on point with that, right? Like people hear intensity and it's automatically, like you said, grindy, like super, like heart rate super high, sweating. Like you said, basically somebody's trying to get ready for a meet every single time they go in and train. And that's not going to be the most productive there.
The other part, just one more thing before you start. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Is with the whole, I just wanted to point out, like a 6 or 7 RPE isn't easy either. Or a 7 or 8 RPE isn't easy. If you've actually got only 3 reps left in the tank, you should be working pretty hard. And that's probably the other part is if you haven't ever trained to failure, it is an important part of understanding training with something like a rating of perceived exertion is to actually push a set to failure or pretty close to failure and think, okay, what did that feel like at 2 reps out, that was actually way harder than I thought it was. And there's those aspects that can be quite good as actually setting a bit of a gauge of what should this feel like at various things. Because when I say a 6 or 7 RPE, someone might be thinking, oh, cruisy warm-up type efforts. No, like you're having to work hard to maintain your technique, and it's still heavy. So yeah, don't get caught up in that trap. I think if you're listening, you think, 6 RPE, that's pretty easy. Yeah, 6 RPE is comfortable, but it's still challenging. 7 RPE, and that's the way I like to think of it, as 10 max F, full all out. 9, man, that was really hard. 8, that was hard. 7, that was comfortably hard. Like those sorts of ways as I like to sometimes think about these rather than just pure reps in reserve. But anyway, sorry, I'll let you get to your point now. I've interrupted.
No, man, that's fine. This is why you're on here. We want to hear your thoughts on this. I'd rather you be talking than me. Like you said, 6, 7, like people hear that and they think easy, but no, it still should be challenging. If it is easy, you're probably not. It's 6, 7 RPE at that point. So again, so far, I think from a different standpoint, we've talked about the skill aspect of it. Strength is a skill. We talked about training close to failure. Again, it's probably going to be a little bit better from a hypertrophy standpoint. From a volume standpoint, sounds like we can get away with a little bit less from a strength standpoint versus if we're trying to go for muscle size. So those are some of the main differences. And then obviously the rep ranges I think are super important too. Obviously from a strength perspective, we want to work in those lower rep ranges. Yeah. And so I guess those are the differences there. What would be maybe some overlap potentially like between the two pursuits?
I think there's plenty, right? Because if we think to like building a lifter, one of the biggest correlations between one of the biggest things that is an indicator of strength is someone's amount of lean muscle mass. So what that tells me straight away is there is benefit to training hypertrophy and to doing some stuff within that. And so one of the big aspects of that is I would say typically we have movements in a powerlifting training program or a strength program, and they would typically be your first exercise of the day or your earlier exercise of the day that are really focused on the movement and trying to improve the skill, the efficiency, the technique. Yes, there's going to be benefits because hypertrophy is a continuum, right? Even at 3-2 reps, there is some hypertrophy benefit to that. We will typically be training higher reps because it's easier to get more volume in with slightly higher reps than it is with the lower reps because you need longer time between sets. If you're doing 2 or 3 hard reps versus if you're doing 8 to 10 hard reps, you can take a little bit less rest. And I think that's probably one of the big pieces of the puzzle in terms of why people have generally tended to go towards high rep ranges for hypertrophy stuff. Sorry, again, a bit of an aside. But with the whole overlap piece, right? A lot of the accessory exercises that powerlifters will do will be very similar. And a lot of the training outside of their main competition lifts will look very similar to what you might see in a typical hypertrophy program, right? You might be doing things that are isolation exercises, for instance. If you're trying to bring up the triceps or the shoulders or whatever it might be, there could be stuff in there that pretty much you are just doing bodybuilding training. And I guess that's the way that a lot of powerlifters will say, we've done our main stuff and now we're going to jump into some bodybuilding training. It's not bodybuilding training, but you get the idea, right? We've trained the movement and now we're going to train the muscle. And some of the other similarities there would be that although we say that there is probably a little bit of a difference in the number of sets, there is still a trend in both aspects that the more volume we do, the more potential there is for that to add gains, all those nuances that we've talked about aside. So a lot of those things are still very similar. So we have the difference in the training, how close do we need to train to failure? But then we also have actually more is typically going to be better in most cases, not always. And so that's a very big similarity between the two, right? So in terms of the total number of sets we're doing, it's probably going to be pretty similar. But then actually when I get into my work after my main lift, it almost will look like bodybuilder style training. And so that stuff would almost be like I am training it as if I am a bodybuilder most of the time. And then probably there is a little bit of a difference there though, in that oftentimes as well, or one of the ways that probably my perceptions have changed around training accessory movements or the stuff that we're training the muscle rather than the movement is sometimes I will actually push that a little bit heavier than I might have typically in the past. Like probably would have always been 8 to 12, 8 to 15 type stuff, which is probably pretty typical in many bodybuilding type or style programs. But sometimes I'll be going to the lower rep ranges now with some of those other movements where I might be doing 5 to 10 ranges for some of that muscle-based stuff, just because of the fact that we still want to train that muscle to get stronger. So sometimes there's a benefit to doing that. But that would probably be where I would say there is the biggest overlap, is that actually the stuff after the main movement is generally going to look very similar. The choices of exercises might be different because we might be trying to target different things, right? If someone has a lockout weakness in bench, maybe they're going to train triceps a bit more, right? Because that's that final piece of the bench press. And so they'll spend a bit more time on that than say a bodybuilder might, because they might be, wanting to bring up the size of the chest because their triceps are already good. And so that's again where the individualization piece comes in. But I think the style of that training outside of the main lift will often be relatively similar. One of the things that I've, learned in this last, or become more aware of in the last 12 months, maybe I've been working with Sebastian Oreb, the Australian strength coach. He's been writing a lot of my powerlifting specific stuff. But his training is, you look at what he does, and essentially there's these movement patterns. We're hitting the movement patterns. We're hitting overhead. We're hitting horizontal. We're doing an even number of those. So I'm not even biasing the number of like pressing movements horizontally. I'm not doing any bias towards that, even though I am a powerlifter, right? I'm still doing, say, two different exercises of those per week, two different exercises of the overhead per week. And that's been something that's been really interesting to me, is like his approach is actually build a robust human who is covering all of their bases and bias the strength work in terms of those first few exercises of the day, but we still train all aspects and all movement patterns and all muscle groups in a relatively similar fashion. So I would say his programming probably you could almost plug and play that and maybe change the first exercise prescription of the day, and you'd probably have a bloody good bodybuilding program, and you'd come up with a pretty decent physique from that. So I think there is heaps and heaps of overlap. It's more the structure and the way that we train, probably those main lifts, that is the difference. And probably the fact that I would say, as a general rule, strength athletes will tend to do a little bit less like pure isolation stuff. Whereas when I'm at the Globo gym doing my training, there'll be other people that are doing multiple sets of, say, curls, right? Probably doesn't add a whole lot to my strength. So I'm not probably going to spend 20 minutes of a session or devote a session to training my biceps. They might get a couple of sets at the end of the workout, so I leave with a pump and I feel good about myself, but it's not going to be like a big pure focus. So I say probably so you have to bear in mind that a lot of like the assumptions I'm making about what someone training for does is based off what I'm perceiving that to be, right? Because it's never been an area that I have 100% pursued myself. Like I've jumped into weightlifting, CrossFit, powerlifting, all of these different things, but I haven't actually ever jumped into and trained with a bodybuilder. But my assumption is that there is a lot more isolation work, and you'll be focusing on specific body parts. Like you might be really interested in the side delt versus the front delt, for instance, to bring up, because that was a weakness that I'm not going to be too worried about that. Did I freeze again?
Yep.
A bodybuilder might be really conscious of the fact that their side delt is smaller than their front delt. And so they will spend some time devoted to that side delt. But for me, or for a powerlifter or a strength athlete, that's not going to be as necessary, because of the fact that unless my side delt is my weakness on my bench press, it doesn't need to take up a whole lot of my training time. Or perhaps maybe I just really don't like the size of my side delts. And so from an aesthetic perspective, I want to spend the time doing that, which is probably the main reason why, most powerlifters will still train arms, because it's cool to have a big set of arms.
Who does? Yeah, no, that's all super interesting stuff. Again, it just comes down to, it sounds like, again, hey, what is your main goal? And then the time aspect of it, right? What do you want to dedicate to? And does that make sense to you? Like for you, it's, if you're really focused on your numbers, like powerlifting is your thing, you want to have the best strength. It's you doing side delts worth the time aspect to it, essentially there. But as you said, there is some carryover to where it's like, hey, having more muscle is going to be helpful from a strength perspective as well too. So they do go hand in hand there. So if you have somebody who, again, they're not powerlifting, because again, if you're powerlifting, that's you obviously have to do those main movements. Someone's like, hey, I just want to be strong, but I also want to look good. I don't like, for you, are you still dedicating some time to some kind of max strength stuff, or what does that kind of look like there?
I think it would really depend on the person, right? Like I have a few people at the moment who their goal isn't strength at all, but yet the way that I like to think about it as well with those sorts of people is a similar concept. With Sebastian, I mentioned he has the different movement patterns he talks about. I tend to think about 6 movement patterns, and I try and expose people to those every week. So a squat pattern, a hinge pattern, vertical and horizontal pressing, and vertical and horizontal pulling. And so typically in the course of someone's training week, I'll be trying to expose someone to all of those movements in a relatively similar amount of total work that they do on each of those. But when I have someone whose objective isn't necessarily to build their back squat, for instance, that squat could be a hack squat, it could be a leg press, it could be a lunge. There's all these sorts of things that are knee dominant patterns that are going to probably train more quads than they are the posterior. And so that would be my approach in that situation, would be you are still going to have something that resembles a squat or trains the muscles of a squat pattern. But if your goal isn't necessarily to push maximal strength in a squat, I won't force that upon you. I have people that I'm coaching at the moment, and that's not their goals. And so actually we don't even have a back squat in their program. And for me, 10 years ago, that's sacrilege, mate. Like I can't do that. But nowadays it's a completely different perspective, because I'm not thinking just from a powerlifter's perspective. I'm thinking from, and this is how any good coach should work. What is important to you? What are you trying to achieve? And how can we make sure you get there? And I like what you mentioned when you were summarizing what I'd said about the whole devoting specific time to specific pieces, right? And I think that's probably the biggest driver of why we have differences in our training processes, is because there is only so much time that you can devote to stuff. There is only so much capacity for you to adapt. And this is, I think, where a lot of the concurrent stuff came from in terms of that training endurance and strength, or endurance and hypertrophy alongside each other, is that it takes a lot of time to develop aerobic capacity. it takes a lot of time to develop hypertrophy. So you can't chase those two rabbits and be world class at both at once, right? That's pretty much impossible. And purely because of the fact that to be world class, you have to devote almost 100% of your training time to that pursuit. So if I'm then trying to train both of these things, yes, I can bring them both up and I can level them both up. But if I wanted to really push one of them, I'm probably going to have to pull away from the other. And I guess that's the same sort of mindset when we think of strength versus hypertrophy is, yes, you can be really strong and you can be really muscular, and those things will generally go hand in hand. But you're not going to see many elite bodybuilders that would be winning titles in powerlifting on a world stage, at least. You probably have a lot of bodybuilders who could win some local stuff, like 100%, no doubt, because they are strong. But there's a difference between the powerlifter strong and the bodybuilder strong. And also just the fact that to get to the powerlifter strong, you're spending more time on that strength stuff, which, yes, it does develop hypertrophy, but it doesn't translate 100% to the strength stuff. To the hypertrophy world. And so therefore, they would be better if their goal is hypertrophy to devote more of the time to that. And so it becomes, a really just a thing of what is the trade-off you want to make and what is the stuff that you want to be pushing the most and devote your time to that, right? And that's the beauty of individualization and getting to work with individuals and that's part that as a coach you need to be really good at, is knowing what is the thing that you actually want and how can we help you get there, right? And for me, the other consideration always is how does this impact health and longevity and those other aspects that actually are also important to you because you have a family and you want to be here for longer. So actually we still need to consider that, hey, maybe you want to be hitting your step goals and these other sorts of things alongside your powerlifting work and not just putting on just mountains and mountains of mass because that's going to make you the strongest. Like for some people, that's the goal. Pursue it, go for it 100%, right? You've taken their consequences into account. For others, you need to be balancing some of those other bits, not as much as someone who is a hybrid athlete, but still we need to consider, are there things that we need to be thinking of from a general health? Because that is also going to affect your ability to adapt. If you're healthier, you're sleeping better, you're eating better, chances are you're adapting better as well.
And I think the other takeaway here from this episode too is, man, life's all about trade-offs too. You got to just figure out which ones are worth it to you and which ones you want to pursue. And as you were saying that, I also think someone that came to mind as you were saying that was Dr. Eric Helms as well too, right? He tried to pursue both and he got to the point where it's like, hey, I need to figure out what is the best kind of route for me to go here. He's got a great physique. He did it. But at the same time, he also got to the point where it's like, hey, if I want to keep going one way or the other, I needed to decide.
I'm thankful he pursued powerlifting for a while. I actually got to meet him and we graduated together from AUT back in 2017, but we shared a platform at the 2013, I think it was, Oceania Powerlifting Champs, which was awesome. Like that was one of the first times that I got to meet him and got to know him. And we then got to have these other things along the way, which I feel like it's been pretty cool. So I'm glad he took up powerlifting for a period of time, Jeff, because it worked well for me. I got to meet the guy and get to know him, which is cool because he's a really nice guy.
Yeah.
And intelligent, very intelligent.
Super nice too. But yeah, I think the big thing though is like, hey, I think if you're building muscle, I think you have a little bit more flexibility with what you can do. But if you want to build strength, it's okay, what does that mean? But also, if you're trying to develop certain lifts, you obviously need to do those and you need to be a little bit more specific with the rep ranges versus I think we just have a little bit more wiggle room there. But again, the hypertrophy will also, make your powerlifting better to a point as well too. So there is like a lot of overlap.
Yeah, heaps of overlap. And I think the other part that we probably want to think with powerlifting as well is it's not all just about the competition movement, right? There's other movements that you can use to help bring up your main movement. And so sometimes you end up devoting time to that stuff as well as, and so therefore that can be another thing where actually I'm going to get a little bit less hypertrophy because now I've got 2 or 3 strength exercises to start my day, which won't necessarily translate exactly. But it's fun, man. And that's what I think I love about training is it's always problem solving, right? You're always trying to figure out how do I make this jigsaw work and get the outcome the person's after.
Absolutely, man. Hey, really appreciate your time. I want to be respectful of it. Before I let you go, is there anywhere where you want to lead the audience to or anything like that or anything coming out on your end?
Probably the main place would just be to head to my Instagram, which is just at HJP Method on Instagram. And I share a bit of stuff there. There's links to research and coaching and all of those other sorts of things. So that's probably the best place because it's everything all at once and probably is the place that I devote most of my social media time to in terms of that trade-off of time as well.
Yep, absolutely, man. Yeah, no, we'll make sure we link that in the show notes. We have that. Again, really appreciate your time, man. A ton of great information in here. And I feel like we could talk about this for hours. We could go on and on. We didn't even hit on the nutrition side of things and how that impacts it. We could go on and on about this. But yeah, I really appreciate your time. We'll have to have you on again in the future. We'll talk to you soon.
Sounds good. Cheers, Matt.